Blood stained the imported marble floor, but Alessio Ferraro only had eyes for her. Gianna stood frozen, the crimson silk of her tight dress clinging to every lush curve. He stepped over a gasping rival, his dark gaze locking onto hers. One reckless question was about to burn Chicago to the ground. Chicago was a city built on cold winds and colder blood, and no one understood that better than Alessio Ferraro. From the penthouse of Ferraro Enterprises, overlooking the sprawling grid of the Magnificent Mile, Alessio ruled the most brutal syndicate in the Midwest. To the public eye, he was a billionaire real estate magnate and philanthropist. To the criminal underworld, he was the Reaper of the Loop, a man who had systematically dismantled his own uncle's empire piece by piece to claim the throne of the Chicago outfit. He was a man of calculated violence, a man who never let emotion dictate his actions, and a man who viewed attachments as fatal liabilities, except when it came to Gianna Costa. Gianna was his executive secretary. That was her official title on the corporate payroll. In reality, she was the brilliant, unbreakable architect of his legitimate business fronts. She was the one who scrubbed the financial ledgers, hid millions of dollars in offshore accounts with a few keystrokes, and navigated the treacherous waters of federal tax audits without ever breaking a sweat. She possessed a mind like a steel trap, forged in the gritty, unforgiving neighborhoods of the South Side, where she had learned at an early age that showing weakness meant inviting destruction. 3 years ago, when the federal government had launched a massive multi-agency sting operation against the Ferraro family, it was Gianna who had stayed awake for 4 days straight, shredding the fake ledgers and fabricating an entirely legitimate paper trail for their shell companies. She had single-handedly saved Alessio from a life sentence in a maximum security facility. From that day on, she was functionally untouchable within the organization. The capos and soldiers knew better than to cross her, but they did not respect her out of fear of her formidable intellect. They respected her because they feared the terrifying wrath of their boss. She was also a woman who completely unraveled Alessio's iron-clad control. In a world filled with emaciated socialites and surgically enhanced mob wives, Gianna was a breathtaking anomaly. She was plus-sized, with lush, generous curves, wide hips, and a soft, full figure that haunted Alessio's every waking thought. She was profoundly self-conscious about her body, entirely unaware of the devastating effect she had on him. To protect herself from the predatory gazes of the Mafia soldiers who roamed the headquarters, Gianna dressed in shapeless, conservative suits. She hid her body behind thick wool and oversized blazers, burying her femininity to maintain her authority in a room full of dangerous men. Alessio allowed this because it kept her safe. He kept his distance, maintaining a facade of frigid professionalism, barking orders and demanding absolute perfection. He convinced himself that keeping her at arm's length was the only way to protect her from the pervasive darkness of his world. If his enemies ever discovered that she was his singular, crippling weakness, she would be dead by morning. But his obsession was a quiet, suffocating thing. He knew the exact shade of her dark hair when the morning sun hit it through the floor-to-ceiling office windows. He knew she drank her coffee black, a bitter habit she had developed to stay awake during long nights of money laundering. He had secretly fired 3 mid-level managers over the past 2 years, simply because he had caught them staring entirely too long at the soft curve of her waist. No one knew this, not even his most trusted underbosses. He was a master of compartmentalization, keeping his violent empire entirely separate from the consuming ache he felt whenever Gianna walked into a room. However, His fragile control was beginning to fracture, largely due to the arrival of Brett Ashford. Brett Ashford was not a traditional mobster who played by the old rules of La Cosa Nostra. He was a modern monster. Ashford was a ruthless venture capitalist, a silver-tongued British expatriate who laundered vast sums of money for a rogue, ultra-violent faction of the Russian Bratva. Armed with hedge funds, offshore trusts, and a private army of highly trained mercenaries, Ashford was aggressively pushing into Ferraro territory. He was trying to seize control of the lucrative shipping contracts at the port of Chicago to smuggle heavy weaponry for his cartel associates. Alessio had been blocking him at every turn, bleeding Ashford's resources dry. But the British criminal was arrogant, reckless, and entirely too confident in his backing. To prevent an all-out street war that would draw the immediate attention of the FBI, Alessio had agreed to a formal sit-down. The meeting was to take place under the guise of an elite charity gala at the historic Drake Hotel. It was considered neutral ground, heavily guarded by heavily armed men from both sides. Alessio desperately needed Gianna there. She was the only person who had the entire financial breakdown of the complex port contracts memorized. She was the only one who could spot the hidden traps and fraudulent numbers in Ashford's proposed ledgers on sight. On the afternoon of the gala, a mundane disaster struck. A careless intern tripped in the office lounge, spilling a tray of scalding coffee all over the conservative black evening gown Gianna had brought to change into. With only 2 hours until the event began, and absolutely no time to navigate rush-hour traffic to go home, Gianna was forced to send her assistant to a nearby high-end boutique on Michigan Avenue to find an immediate replacement. The assistant returned 20 minutes later with only one dress that fit Gianna's specific measurements. Gianna stared at the garment in the executive washroom, her heart hammering frantically against her ribs. It was made of crimson-red silk, and it was tight. It was criminal, unapologetic, and aggressively tight. The dress featured a sweetheart neckline that prominently showcased the generous swell of her chest, a tightly cinched waist that emphasized her dramatic hourglass shape, and a long skirt that clung desperately to the flare of her wide hips and thick thighs before finally cascading to the floor. It left absolutely nothing to the imagination. There was no shapeless blazer to hide behind. There was only her, exposed in all her curvy, undeniable glory. She almost backed out. She almost picked up her phone to call Alessio and lie, saying she was violently ill. But Gianna Costa did not run. She had survived crushing poverty. She had survived the brutal men of the South Side streets, and she survived working daily for the most dangerous crime boss in Chicago. She was certainly not going to let a piece of red silk defeat her. She zipped up the dress, applied a heavy layer of deep red lipstick like war paint, and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night, completely unaware that she was about to ignite a devastating powder keg. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a glittering sea of expensive diamonds, tailored designer tuxedos, and heavily concealed firearms. The air was thick with the scent of vintage champagne, expensive perfume, and the underlying electric tension of rival syndicates sharing the exact same oxygen. Alessio Ferraro stood near the sweeping marble staircase, nursing a glass of aged scotch. His sharp features formed an impenetrable mask of indifference as his underbosses whispered continuous security updates into his ear. Then the heavy oak doors of the ballroom slowly opened, and Gianna walked in. The effect was entirely instantaneous. The low murmur of polite conversation in the immediate vicinity died abruptly. Heads turned in unison. Crystal glasses paused halfway to open mouths. Alessio felt all the air vanish from his lungs in a single, painful rush. He gripped his Scotch glass so hard it groaned, threatening to shatter into bloody shards in his hand. She was a vision of absolute destructive beauty. The crimson dress molded to her lush curves like a second layer of skin, highlighting the soft, yielding shape of her body that he had spent 3 agonizing years dreaming about. Every step she took across the carpet was a hypnotic, swaying rhythm of rounded hips and quiet, determined confidence. She looked terrified, but she held her chin high, her dark, intelligent eyes scanning the treacherous room with the sharp vigilance he relied on every single day. But Alessio was not the only man looking. He watched, his blood rapidly turning to liquid fire, as the predatory gazes of 100 dangerous men locked onto his secretary. They stripped her completely bare with their eyes. The quiet murmurs started again, this time filled with vulgar speculation, heavy breathing, and hungry intent. A dark, territorial beast clawed its way violently up Alessio's throat. He wanted to lock the heavy ballroom doors, draw his weapon, and burn the historic hotel to the ground, just to wipe the sight of her from their filthy memories. Before Alessio could cross the massive room to shield her from the onslaught of stairs, another man beat him to it. Brett Ashford, the venture capitalist, slithered smoothly through the wealthy crowd, his tailored midnight blue tuxedo contrasting sharply with his pale, aristocratic features. Ashford intercepted Gianna near the towering champagne fountain, deliberately blocking her path toward the Ferraro tables with a smooth, highly predatory smile. Alessio froze in his tracks, his muscles coiling tightly like a striking snake. He immediately began to walk toward them, his long, predatory strides eating up the distance. His aura radiated such pure, unadulterated, murderous intent that hardened Mafia enforcers actively scrambled out of his way to avoid his path. Gianna held her ground firmly as Ashford approached. She recognized him instantly from the detailed intelligence dossier she had personally prepared. She knew exactly how deadly he was. "Good evening, Miss Costa," Ashford purred, his British accent dripping with false, oily charm. He let his cold gaze drop deliberately to her chest, lingering there for an insulting, agonizing amount of time before dragging his eyes slowly down the dramatic curve of her hips. "I must say, Ferraro has kept you entirely too hidden from the world. If I knew his back-office accountant looked like an absolute feast, I would have hostilely taken over his boardroom years ago." "I am not his accountant, Mr. Ashford," Gianna said, her voice remarkably steady and piercingly cold. "And I am certainly not on the menu tonight. If you want to discuss the Chicago port contracts, you can speak directly to Mr. Ferraro. If you want to make crude remarks, you can go find a mirror." Ashford let out a low, amused chuckle, stepping uncomfortably close to her space. He reached out casually, his long fingers brushing a stray, dark curl from her bare shoulder. Gianna did not flinch or back away, but her dark eyes flared with a severe warning. "Feisty," Ashford murmured, leaning in so close she could smell the sharp tang of gin on his breath. "I like a woman with a little actual meat on her bones and real fire in her veins. Tell me, Gianna, what does a miserable man like Ferraro pay a beautiful creature like you? Because whatever it is, I will easily triple it. Come work for me. You can wear exquisite dresses like this every single night, and I promise you, I will thoroughly appreciate every single curve." Gianna took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, her mind calculating rapidly. "You do not have a financial lifeline to offer me, Mr. Ashford. I audited your proposed accounts this morning. You are massively hemorrhaging money in your shell companies in Malta. You do not want the Chicago ports for tactical expansion. You are desperate for an immediate cash flow, because the Volkov cartel is threatening to break your legs if you do not pay them back their initial investment by the end of the month. Ashford's face instantly dropped. His charming, aristocratic facade vanished entirely, replaced by sheer, unadulterated malice. He suddenly grabbed her upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into her soft skin. "You little bitch," he hissed, his accent thickening with rage. "You think a fat ledger makes you untouchable in my world? I can have you disappear into Lake Michigan before the appetizers are even served." He aggressively dropped his free hand to her waist, his fingers pressing hard into the soft, yielding flesh above her hip. Digging into the crimson silk, the temperature in the grand ballroom seemed to plummet to absolute zero. Alessio stepped up silently behind Ashford. The sheer, overwhelming force of his physical presence was enough to make the surrounding crowd of criminals back away in absolute, breathless terror. "Remove your hand, Ashford," Alessio said. His voice was not a loud shout. It was a low, guttural rasp, barely above a conversational whisper, yet it carried the terrifying weight of a final execution order. Ashford stiffened in surprise, but his arrogance won out, and he did not immediately remove his hand from Gianna's waist. He turned his head slightly, a smug, challenging smile playing on his thin lips. "Ferraro, I was just getting properly acquainted with your incredibly lovely assistant. You really do hoard all the best assets in Chicago for yourself." Alessio did not even look at Ashford's face. His dark, intensely burning gaze was locked entirely on Gianna. He saw the slight, hidden tremor in her hands holding the champagne flute, the brave, stubborn defiance shining in her dark eyes, and the absolutely disgusting mark of Ashford's pale fingers pressing into the crimson silk right at her waist. The heavy iron cage Alessio had painstakingly kept around his heart for 3 long years, violently shattered into dust. Professionalism was dead. Strategic caution was dead. There was only the primal, overwhelming need to publicly claim what was his and utterly destroy anything that threatened it. Alessio reached out, grabbed Ashford forcefully by the lapels of his custom tuxedo, and hurled him backward with terrifying, unnatural strength. Ashford flew through the air and crashed heavily into a crystal cocktail table, shattering glass everywhere and sending expensive liquor spraying across the polished dance floor. Loud gasps erupted across the room. Bodyguards from both syndicates immediately reached inside their tailored jackets, gripping the handles of their weapons. The ballroom was exactly 1 second away from devolving into a catastrophic bloodbath. But Alessio ignored the rising chaos entirely. He stepped directly into Gianna's personal space, his broad, muscular shoulders entirely blocking her view of the ruined table and the stunned crowd. He reached out gently, his large, calloused hands slowly tracing the exact curve of her waist where Ashford had just touched her, as if he were physically erasing the other man's filthy existence from her skin. Gianna stared up at him, her breath hitching loudly in her throat at the raw, unfiltered obsession burning openly in his dark eyes. This was not the cold, calculating, distant boss she had known for years. This was a man completely possessed. Alessio leaned down, his face mere inches from hers, his lips brushing lightly against her ear. But when he spoke, his voice was loud and clear enough to carry through the dead, tense silence of the massive room. He delivered the question that would permanently shatter their professional facade and rewrite the violent rules of the Chicago underworld forever. "Gianna," Alessio whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, suffocatingly jealous rage. Who gave you permission to wear a dress that forces me to kill every single man in this room for daring to look at what belongs strictly to me? The silence in the grand ballroom shattered into chaos. Dozens of weapons cleared their holsters, the metallic clicks echoing like a firing squad. Alessio Ferraro did not draw his gun. He did not need to. His enforcers formed an impenetrable human wall around him and Gianna Costa. Brett Ashford scrambled up from the ruined crystal, bleeding from a deep gash on his forehead, his face twisted in humiliated rage. Alessio gave a single nod to his underboss. The signal was clear. If anyone moved, the Drake Hotel would become a graveyard. Alessio wrapped his large hand firmly around Gianna's waist, his grip possessive and unyielding, and marched her out of the ballroom. They moved rapidly through the service corridors, flanked by heavily armed guards, until they reached the armored SUV waiting in the freezing Chicago alleyway. Alessio shoved her inside and climbed in after her, the heavy doors slamming shut and sealing them in the quiet, leather-scented interior. The drive to his fortified penthouse in the Gold Coast was suffocating. Gianna sat rigidly, the crimson silk of her tight dress feeling like a target painted directly on her chest. Alessio stared out the darkened window, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles fluttered beneath his skin. The terrifying Mafia boss had exposed his only weakness to the entire criminal underworld. Because of a dress. Because of a jealous, reckless impulse. When the private elevator doors opened into his sprawling, multi-level penthouse, Alessio dismissed his guards. The massive steel doors locked behind them. They were completely alone. Gianna finally turned on him, her dark eyes flashing with a mix of leftover adrenaline and suppressed fury. She was not a fragile mob wife. She was the architect of his survival. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Gianna demanded, her voice echoing in the cavernous, glass-walled living room. "You just declared war on a Bratva-backed syndicate in front of the entire Chicago outfit. Over what? A wounded ego? You blew 3 years of careful diplomacy because Brett Ashford touched my hip." Alessio turned slowly. He walked toward her, his predatory stride eating up the distance until he trapped her against the edge of a massive marble kitchen island. He caged her in, placing a hand on the counter on either side of her wide hips. "Diplomacy is for men who do not have what is theirs threatened," Alessio said, his voice dropping into a lethal, vibrating register. "He touched you. He looked at you like you were a piece of meat on a butcher block. Do you have any idea what it took for me not to shoot him between the eyes right there on the dance floor?" "I am not yours," Gianna fired back, though her breath hitched as his chest brushed against the plunging sweetheart neckline of her dress. "I am your executive secretary. I balance your ledgers. I launder your blood money. I am an employee." Alessio let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He reached up, his rough fingers tracing the bare skin of her shoulder, sliding down the curve of her collarbone. "An employee," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the generous swell of her chest, then tracking slowly down the dramatic cinch of her waist and the flare of her thick thighs. "I have spent 1,000 days staring at you through the glass of my office. I have watched you hide this body behind hideous wool suits. I convinced myself that if I kept my distance, I could keep you safe from the monsters I deal with. But tonight, I saw every monster in that room, looking at you the way I have wanted to look at you since the day you walked into my life." He leaned closer, inhaling the scent of her perfume. "You think I care about the Volkov cartel?" Alessio whispered against her lips. "You think I care about the port contracts? I would burn the entire city of Chicago to ash before I let another man put his hands on you." Gianna felt the last of her defenses crumble. The impenetrable wall she had built to survive the violent, ruthless world of the Ferraro syndicate vanished. She reached up, her hands tangling desperately in the lapels of his jacket, pulling him down to her. The kiss was explosive. It tasted like aged scotch, impending violence, and 3 years of suffocating denial. Alessio groaned, a primal, heavy sound, as he finally wrapped his arms around her lush, yielding curves, pulling her flush against his hard, muscular frame. The crimson dress that had caused an underworld war was suddenly the only thing standing in his way. He tore at the zipper, his control completely obliterated by the soft, desperate sounds she made against his mouth. That night, amidst the impending threat of a cartel bloodbath, the Reaper of the Loop worshipped the curvy, brilliant woman who held his empire and his dark soul entirely in her hands. War came to Chicago before the sun rose. Brett Ashford, humiliated and desperate to prove his dominance to his Russian backers, launched a massive, coordinated assault. By 4 a.m., Ashford mercenaries had firebombed 3 of Ferraro's legitimate warehouses on the south side and ambushed 2 of his distribution convoys near the Indiana border. In the penthouse, the romantic haze evaporated instantly. Alessio stood in the center of his tactical room, coordinating counterattacks with his capos over encrypted phones. His face was a mask of cold, calculated murder. Gianna sat at the massive mahogany table, wearing one of Alessio's oversized dress shirts, her fingers flying across the keyboard of her heavily encrypted laptop. Ashford has 300 heavily armed men mobilizing near the shipping yards. Alessio barked into the phone, slamming his hand on the desk. Tell the strike teams to load the heavy artillery. We kill every single one of them who crosses into our territory. No prisoners. Gianna stopped typing. She looked up from the glowing screen, her dark hair a messy halo around her shoulders. Call your men off, Alessio, she said calmly. Alessio turned to her, his brow furrowed in aggressive confusion. I cannot call them off. Ashford is pushing for a hostile takeover. If I show weakness, the outfit will bleed us dry. You do not need to fire a single bullet to destroy him, Gianna stated, turning her laptop screen toward him. I told you yesterday, Ashford is desperate for cash. The Volkov cartel gave him $50 million to secure the Chicago port contracts. He used $40 million of it to cover bad investments in Malta, assuming he could use the port revenue to pay them back before they noticed. She tapped a single key. A string of offshore banking transfers cascaded down the screen. I just froze his remaining $10 million, Gianna continued, her voice devoid of any emotion. I routed it through 7 dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands and dropped it directly into an anonymous charity fund in Geneva. Then I bypassed his firewall and sent a copy of his real financial ledgers directly to the head of the Volkov cartel in Moscow. Alessio stared at the screen, then looked slowly up at the beautiful, dangerously brilliant woman sitting at his table. Gianna took a sip of her black coffee. Brett Ashford stole $50 million from the Russian Bratva, she said quietly, and now they know it. He does not have an army anymore, Alessio. He is a dead man walking. 10 minutes later, Alessio's encrypted phone rang. It was his lead scout at the shipping yards. Ashford's mercenaries were suddenly packing up and abandoning their posts in a blind panic. Ashford himself had been seen fleeing toward his private jet at O'Hare International Airport. He is trying to run, Alessio said, drawing his weapon and checking the magazine. The Russians will catch him eventually, but I'm not going to give them the satisfaction. He touched you. That makes him mine. Alessio left the penthouse with a strike team. He caught Ashford on the tarmac, just as the jet engines were spinning up. The execution was swift, brutal, and entirely public to the criminal underworld. The Reaper of the Loop had sent a definitive message. No one touched his emperor, and absolutely no one looked at his woman. When Alessio returned to the penthouse as the morning sun broke over Lake Michigan, Gianna was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city she had just saved, with nothing but a keyboard and her brilliant mind. Alessio walked up behind her, wrapping his arms securely around her waist, pulling her soft curves back against his chest. He buried his face in her dark hair, inhaling deeply, letting the violence of the night wash away. "You are terrifying, you know that," Alessio murmured against her neck. "I have 100 armed killers working for me, and you took down a cartel-backed kingpin in your bare feet before breakfast." Gianna leaned back into his embrace, a slow, confident smile spreading across her face. "Someone has to keep this syndicate running efficiently while you are out throwing men through cocktail tables." Alessio turned her around to face him. He looked deep into her eyes, the obsessive protective fire burning brighter than ever. "You are never wearing a shapeless wool suit again," he commanded softly. "You are not going to hide in the shadows of my office anymore. You are going to stand right beside me. You own me, Gianna. You own this city." Gianna Costa, the girl from the gritty streets of the South Side, had walked into a room in a tight red dress and brought the most dangerous mafia boss in Chicago to his knees. She was no longer just the executive secretary. She was the undisputed queen of the Ferraro Syndicate, and together they would rule the underworld forever. If you loved this gripping tale of high-stakes tension, dark romance, and explosive mafia drama, please hit that like button right now. Do not forget to share this story with your friends, and drop a comment below letting us know your favorite part. Was it Gianna's brilliant revenge, or Alessio's ruthless devotion? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our thrilling, immersive stories. See you in the next one.